So I'm sure everyone's seeing that demonstration of how they work, particularly if you hadn't had the chance to use them before. Probably really keen to get started on them. I mean, I've got to say, having been involved in writing the history ones, obviously they're available across all the subjects, but having been writing the history ones myself, I'm really keen on these. I think they're a very useful resource. And I've got to say, from a writing point of view, I actually really enjoyed writing them. It was a great project to be involved with. So, what I want to do is just for a few minutes is share with you a little bit about how they were put together, because I think from a teaching point of view, with 2022 in mind, you're thinking really about student preparation, about what happens if we need teacher assessed grades and so on. So by just spending a little bit of time showing you how these were put together, I think it might give you a confidence that they really are a useful resource. So really the question is, who are they for? And I suppose that depends who you are and what you want out of them. But they were created with the idea of being something useful for teachers, heads of department, and students, in the sense that what teachers need is something that is easy to use in a technical sense, because the last thing we want is something really complicated to get our heads around. We need to know it's going to use expected subject language so there's no surprises, and that the language level, including with the mark schemes, is something that you could use with students without confusing them or creating whole new problems for yourself. But then, speaking as a head of department, and I'm sure some of you on today probably have those kind of responsibilities, there's other issues that you've got in your mind, like how will you standardize it? Will it deviate from the exam board's own model questions? Will it give reliable data? And perhaps we could say that in 2022, that's probably never been as much of a concern this year has probably been more of a concern than in any other year past, because we're thinking about making sure we have data should we need it. And for student point of view, well, again, they need to understand what it is. They need to be based in spec content, because there's no use asking them about things that they're not going to be actually learning. Then you're requiring them to use knowledge you might not have given them. And it's got to be easy to access, because as I already said, otherwise you're just creating a rod for your own back in the sense of complicating this. So when we put it together, the first priority was getting the content right. So one of the things I did, for example, this is just some screenshots of some of my notes. I've got pages and pages of them. Was looking back through existing exam papers to work out what's already been covered, so that with kind of an exam writing head on, I could come up with papers that were going to represent the coverage of the paper, but also be genuinely original in terms of questions and content. Then, of course, there was getting the style right, because talking with the way exams might be running this year, we need to know that the materials that are being set are in the right style for the exam board that you're working with. And there's various things to consider with that. And if you've tried writing your own exam questions, you've probably come across this. Or if you've tried using textbooks which weren't quite written for your exam board, you might have discovered some of these issues that can come up. There's getting the language right, not only in terms of level, but in terms of the way certain topics are described. There's the question stems, of course. There's the content range in terms of what should be in the exam, making sure there's a breadth of topics, but also that the questions themselves, for example, history, certain questions have to cover a certain number of years or a certain number of points, and the nature of the stimulus material. And added to that, of course, subject-specific words might not always be used in the same way between exam boards. One board may use it in a different way to the way another exam board does, and this can sometimes raise issues. Just to exemplify this, and I've used some history examples simply because that's my area of subject specialism, but the examples here are just simply to exemplify what happens across the range of subjects. Getting the style right really meant getting the key concepts right for the paper. Things like sources, like evidence, like diagrams, because they don't necessarily mean the same thing between exam boards. Just to illustrate that here, we have here two sources from the same topic, which is the history of medicine, covered by two different major exam boards here, Edexcel and AQA, and yet actually their requirements for what they would call a source A on their papers for this topic are completely different. You couldn't use the same sources, so it was necessary to ensure that the sources for the Edexcel one and the AQA one were different and appropriate for the exam boards. Similarly, an interesting example here is in history again, we use the word interpretation all the time. It's a very subject specific word. And yet all the exam boards handle it in a slightly different way. So, on the very same topic here, which is to do with Nazi Germany, both exam boards have an interpretation. Not only do they have a different numbering system, interpretation 2 for Edexcel, interpretation A for AQA, but actually what's required and how they consider that to be treated is different. So they're different in the number of words, in the way it's laid out, and actually, from a historian's point of view, they're completely different in terms of style of content. And then the questions themselves. Well, as you'll know well, you could teach the same topic for two different exam boards, and the way that it is assessed, the way that the questions work, are completely different. And if you've ever tried using a generic textbook, maybe one that is designed for multiple exam boards, you've likely come across this very same issue. So here we have the same topic, which here is the rise of the Nazi Party in the late 1920s, early 1930s, from an Edexcel and an AQA style. And as you can probably immediately see, even if it's not your subject, the layout of the questions is completely different. The number of marks is very different. The structuring of the questions, the question stems, it wouldn't have been appropriate to set the alternative type of question. And so this was something that had to be factored in getting this right. And Helen did mention the mark schemes. So many of the questions, where appropriate, come with a mark scheme, particularly the ones in subjects where it's a free text box and there needs to be indicative content. And the exam mark schemes, I suppose in some ways are a tricky thing, because from a teacher point of view, you need to know that they're going to meet the exam requirements. And in fact, in terms of collecting data with the potential for possible teacher assessed grades in the year, if that was to become necessary, you need to know that the way you've marked your work is in a standard that would be accepted to the marking of the exam board. That's a requirement for that type of data. So it's got to be used by teachers in a way that is useful and practical, but it's also got to be something that students can understand. If you're going to use this as a teaching tool down the line, then the language of it and the style of writing has to be managed. Just an aside in the yellow bubble, but it was already mentioned by Helen. One of the things you might be thinking about was marks. How do you handle this? Well, this does allow you to hold back the marks until you're ready to share them. And that's an important feature to know about with a view to 2022 data collection. One other aspect, and I suppose in a way we're looking at what makes this unique compared to, say, a past paper, is the link to GCSE pod videos. I just screenshotted. I thought you'd have had enough of history examples, so I found a biology one instead. Um, the papers themselves, if downloaded, come with links to some of the pods that could be relevant. Now that can be hidden until after the assignment's done. They don't have to be made available, but it is good to know that they are there. The work's been done for you to relate the questions to useful video pods, so that the connection is there from a kind of revision and recap point of view. So, summarizing all of that, what does it mean with the exam style assessments? Well, it means that when you find them, they're exam board specific, and they were written by subject specialists like myself using exam writing methods. I approached them in the same way that I would have approached writing a live exam paper. I used the same kind of processes for identifying topic areas, identifying assessment objectives, and so on. They can be answered using exam board guidance and existing approaches. So that means that whatever you've already got in place, if you've got ways where you tell your students to approach it, you've got those there to use. They'll work with these. They are original questions, and of course the data collection for potential teacher assessed grades requires these to be kind of new questions or questions students haven't seen. So these are original. They're not just duplicates of what you'll find on past papers. And because of the way they're written and marked, they're very easy to standardize. So as a head of department point of view, you can make these reliable as evidence of performance, because you can really show how your students are performing individually, but also as part of a cohort in comparison. So kind of turning that into how this can help, we are talking about a quite unusual situation in 2022. And I'm sure I'm telling you something here that you're absolutely aware of. I don't mean to, go over things that you already know, but there essentially are two possible assessment outcomes for this year. One is that exams go ahead, and we really hope that that's going to happen. That's the kind of the desirable option, I guess, with formal exams for students. But even in that instance, teachers are still trying to make sure they've got the right data for their potential tags, were that to be required. There is always still the possibility of exams being cancelled and returning to teacher assessed grades. And that's going to be in the back of everyone's mind, myself included, as you're going through the year in a way that it wouldn't have been in what we might call a normal year. And I think that really creates two issues that these can be used to address. One is the need for data for possible tags, but at the same time, talking about our students a little bit, these are students that might have had limited access to exam experience. I mean, let's face it, if you consider a normal year, I just picture standing outside the exam hall with some of my year 11s, with them getting so worked up before the exams in the session. You've probably all been in the same place as me, trying to calm down and say it's going to be okay, just remember how we talked through it. These are students who perhaps have had a lot less experience of that. So the idea of being in the exam could even be more challenging for them. That's part of the reason why Ofqual have given such good guidance on trying to deal with that, with things like reducing the number of exams. So how could these assessments help with potential teacher assessed grades? Well, because you can keep them private until publication, you can use these as a way of collecting the data you need for your data collection points, however you're doing them. They can be kept away so students don't see the questions. That fulfills the requirements of making sure these are unseen. They are original written questions, so they're not going to be ones that you've already got on your existing resources and things. They can be done online. Helen gave a great demonstration of that, how they can work online, and I think that's a great option. But there is the alternative of printing them off. If your school is heading in a direction where it really does need to be on paper, well, they're still there as an available tool for you, and they can be printed off into a usable option, and there's actually an accessible format with it as well. So these could be a great way of creating one of your data points by using them as a resource. And I think that's kind of simple how you'd use those. That's in simply to use them as a part or whole paper with a mark scheme that your department can easily standardize and use. But what about the other challenge, which in some ways I think is more difficult, helping students to get ready for exams when they might have limited experience? Well, obviously, they can be assigned as whole papers, but you have the option of setting them individually. You can break it down as much as you want, and it might be that you can use them as individual items better. And because they work with existing exam guidance and approaches, and they've been constructed to look like the questions students are going to see on the exam in style and layout, then that's really useful for your students. Because they're online, of course, you've got the option of using them in class. They can be used as homework, but they also, I suppose, are useful if you have isolating students as well. There's that opportunity there. And because the mark schemes where they're relevant have been written to be accessible, well, that's good for self-marking, but it's also good for peer marking exercise and for students being able to improve their answers. So I guess I've got three suggestions really from a practical point of view as to how I've got these for use. One of them is very simply for students to have a go at these questions with your exam guides, using them to have a go at the answer, and then using the mark schemes for marking, but then for improving the answer, so that students can use the content in the mark scheme to see how they can improve the answer and really get them to focus on getting the right material down in the question. Because as an examiner, every year, and I'm expecting to see it this year ahead, you see students who've revised, they know things, but they just haven't got their head around how to structure the answer or how to put it down on the paper. And so this is a great tool for working on that. Second option is for working with the content in the videos. So because they're linked to the GCSE pods and the playlists, I think that opens up something that isn't available with alternatives like simple past papers downloaded off an exam website. And there's a couple of ways of doing it, but my personal favorite, I like to try the questions by what I call taking out the content. And obviously you can't take the content out in an absolute sense. What I mean by that is allowing the students to work with the question, without having to worry about the content. So what you've got as an option, if you're not using it for tag data, is that you could even give the students the pods that are relevant for the question, let them go home as homework, revise it, so that when they come in and answer the question, they've already got the knowledge fixed. And that means when you work on the question using this tool, what you're actually doing is working on how they answer the question. You're working on kind of the technical and exam experience side of it, rather than students panicking over the knowledge. And I think that's one way that this works together really well. So in summary then, there's two different kind of ways of using these with review to this year. One is the most similar, either online or printed off, used as a simple blind assessment for tag data, so that if we get to that point, you've got the data. Or perhaps in a more useful way, in my opinion, is for using it as an exam technique teaching tool in conjunction with the video content.